Imagine walking off the job because you hadn't been paid, 3,000 years before unions existed. That's where we start. Odd, eerie, and unmistakably human. These are 50 creepy secrets from ancient Egypt that shocked the world. Some will make you admire their ingenuity, others will make your skin crawl, but all of them show a civilization that was, in many ways, not that different from ours. 1. They staged what looks like the world's first recorded strike. Workers at Deir el-Medina, stonecutters and artisans who built royal tombs, refused to work when their rations were delayed. Papyri record formal complaints and negotiations with officials. The documents read like a labor dispute, demands, threats, and payment schedules. Why it matters? It upends the myth that ancient societies lacked organized labor. These were skilled workers who knew their leverage. 2. Women could own property, sue, and sign contracts. Egyptian legal papyri show women buying land, managing businesses, and initiating divorce, a legal status rare in many ancient societies. Queens like Hatshepsut rose to become pharaoh, and everyday contracts record women acting independently. Why it matters? It forces us to rethink gender assumptions about the ancient world and shows a complex social fabric. 3. Royal incest was politically useful and socially weird by modern standards. Marriages within the royal family, brother-sister unions, were a tactic to concentrate power and maintain divine lineage. The practice has genetic and symbolic consequences. It reinforced claims of divine blood while producing the biological problems we now associate with close inbreeding. Why it matters? It explains odd genealogies and some recurring health issues among rulers. 4. Courts could be brutal, and the records are frankly chilling. Papyri preserve criminal trials, punishments, and confessions. Corporal punishment, forced labor, and public shaming appear repeatedly. Some records suggest the state prioritized order over individual rights in clear ways. Why it matters? These documents are early case studies in how a centralized state enforced social norms. 5. Hygiene and labor had strict social divisions. There's evidence that different classes handled different bodily tasks. Embalming was a sacred specialized profession, while mundane sanitation belonged to other groups. Worker villages like Deir el-Medina had communal latrines, bakeries, and workshops, organized but unequal. Why it matters? The daily infrastructure reminds us that civilization is built on repetitive, often invisible labor. 6. Tomb robbery was a bureaucratic nightmare, and there were trials for it. Court records from the New Kingdom reveal organized tomb-robbing rings, arrests, and prosecutions. For centuries, archaeologists have found patched-up tombs and recorded trials where thieves name accomplices, sometimes under duress. Why it matters? It shows that even the afterlife economy, grave goods, offerings, rituals, was worth stealing and policing. If you're loving these ancient shocks, hit subscribe for more deep dives. This is only getting stranger. 7. The screaming mummy might be a murder mystery from inside the palace. A set of mummies with grotesque expressions, one called the screaming mummy, has long fueled speculation. Some scholars link one disfigured burial to the harem conspiracy against Ramses III, mid-1100s BCE. CT scans and forensic analysis hint at unusual death circumstances for certain elites. Why it matters? It's a macabre intersection of politics, assassination, and funerary practice that feels like a true ancient whodunit. 8. Royal titles hid political chaos. Names carved out of stone tell a darker story. Pharaohs erased predecessors from monuments, damnatio memoriae by chiseling out names, to rewrite history and erase rivals. Those smooth patches on statues are silent evidence of palace intrigue. Why it matters? The monuments themselves become courtroom evidence, showing how power was policed through memory. 9. They packed board games into tombs, so the dead could keep playing. Senet, an ancient board game, appears repeatedly in burial contexts, including Tutankhamun's tomb. Painted scenes show the game used as a metaphorical journey to the afterlife. Some boards were included as grave goods, implying the dead might need diversion or symbolic assistance. Why it matters? It reveals a culture that blurred play, ritual, and belief in the afterlife. 10. Priests were gatekeepers. Religious power came with political muscle. Temple priesthoods controlled enormous wealth, land, and labor. Rituals weren't just spiritual acts, but economic engines. The daily temple routines required staff, livestock, and food logistics, making temples central hubs. Why it matters: religion and state were tightly interwoven. Priests often acted as administrators and bankers. 11. Cats were sacred, and that reverence had bloody consequences. Cats were associated with deities like Bastet, and were mummified and buried in dedicated cemeteries in huge numbers. There's a famous reported episode. When Persian forces confronted Egyptian defenders at Pelusium, they allegedly used cats to demoralize the Egyptians, an account told by ancient authors, but debated by modern scholars. Why it matters: whether myth or fact, it shows how animals could be symbols of protection and leverage in warfare. Account of Cambyses at Pelusium is recorded in Greek sources. Scholars debate its accuracy. 12. Animal mummification created entire industries. Millions of mummified animals, cats, ibis, crocodiles, filled dedicated tombs and votive caches, implying large-scale breeding, ritual economies, and commercialization of piety. Evidence: animal necropolises and catalogued mummies. Why it matters: religious devotion drove market systems on a massive scale and created jobs that fed back into religious institutions. 13. The Book of the Dead was a personalized survival guide for the afterlife. Funerary texts included spells, maps, and instructions scrawled on papyri to guide the deceased through judgment scenes. Practical instructions to navigate supernatural hazards. Variations in spells show personalization. Some wealthy individuals had lavish, illustrated copies. Why it matters: it's an ancient self-help manual for eternity, revealing both fear and hope about what comes next. 14. Mummification techniques evolved, and not everything was sacred. Embalming involved removal of organs, desiccation with natron, and elaborate wrapping, practices that varied over time and status. Chemical analyses show that embalming substances included plant oils, resins, and bitumen, some of which had preservative or antimicrobial effects. Why it matters: mummification was a mix of ritual and proto-chemistry. Their formulae sometimes worked better than superstition alone would suggest. 15. Cosmetic powders may have had real medical benefits. Coal and green malachite used as eye makeup contained copper compounds, which modern tests suggest may have antimicrobial properties. Applied regularly, they could have helped prevent infections. Evidence comes from chemical analysis of residues and comparisons with medical texts. Why it matters: what looks like decoration could be healthcare, an elegant overlap of beauty and hygiene. 16. Dentistry was basic, but they tried. Archaeology shows severe tooth wear from gritty bread, and some remains suggest rudimentary dental treatments. Dental problems were common and painful. Evidence: microscopic analysis of dental calculus and tools. Why it matters: it reminds us that daily diet, stone-ground grains, left a literal mark on bodies. 17. They invented a kind of toothpaste and a toothache economy. Recipes found on papyri suggest mixtures of pumice, ash, and flavoring agents intended to clean teeth. While abrasive, some formulations may have reduced plaque mechanically. Why it matters: oral care isn't a modern invention. People found ways to manage hygiene long before toothpaste tubes. 18. Contraception and fertility testing existed in surprising forms. Medical papyri describe pessaries, honey and acacia mixtures, and fertility-related procedures. Some prescriptions sound like contraceptives or early fertility tests. Evidence: Eber's papyrus and other medical texts list recipes and protocols. Why it matters: reproductive health was an ancient concern, and people experimented with methods that echo in later folk remedies. 19. Surgeons practiced advanced wound care and surgical techniques. The Edwin Smith papyrus reads like a clinical manual: detailed trauma cases, examination protocols, and treatments. It describes suturing, splints, and knowledge of the brain and spinal cord in trauma contexts. Why it matters: It rewrites the narrative of medicine as a slow linear march. Egyptians combined practical observation with effective interventions. 20. Pharmacology was surprisingly modern in parts. Herbal recipes, ointments, and poultices are listed alongside surgical instructions. Combinations of plants, resins, and minerals indicate systematic approaches to treatment. Evidence: ebers, papyrus inventories, hundreds of remedies. Why it matters: ancient pharmacopoeias were empirical databases that underpinned medical practice for centuries. 21. Embalming mistakes created bizarre burials. Not every mummy is a perfect specimen. Some bodies show odd wrapping patterns, evisceration errors, or hurried interments, sometimes because embalmers were rushed or cheap. Some mummies were bound in ways that create startling expressions or contorted positions. Why it matters: the uncanny faces we sometimes see are often human error, not supernatural curse. 22. The health of pharaohs didn't match their statues. Statues idealized kings as youthful and robust, but skeletal and CT analyses show obesity, bone disease, and infections in some royal mummies. The contrast between public image and private body is stark. Why it matters: it's a reminder that political image-making is ancient. Statues sell a story, not always the truth. 23. The princes implicated in palace plots could meet odd fates. Documents and trial records hint at internal purges after failed conspiracies. Some accused nobles were executed, others given shameful burials, and at least one seems to have been mummified in an unusual way, a candidate for the screaming mummy theory. Why it matters: the messy consequences of power grabs were tangible, recorded, and sometimes preserved for us to dissect. 24. Laxatives, enemas, and hygiene advice appear in medical guides. Practical treatments for constipation, pain, and infection are common in medical papyri. Hygiene was as much a public health measure as a ritual duty. Why it matters: many everyday health rituals, cleansing, diet, topical treatments, have their roots in empirically observed benefits survived in cultural memory. 25. Sexual practices and moral codes coexisted with pragmatic law. Law codes and contracts address marriage, adultery, dowries, and sexual offenses in ways that sometimes surprise. Penalties exist, but so do negotiated settlements and economic solutions. Evidence: legal papyri with divorce agreements, settlement terms, and witness lists. Why it matters: sexual behavior was governed by law as much as by religion. The interplay of economics, honor, and family shaped intimate life. 26. The next secret moves us into the engineering and science that made Egypt possible. 26. The Egyptian solar calendar was literally written in the stars. Egyptians tracked the year by watching the heliacal rising of Sirius and timing it to the Nile's flood. This astronomical routine turned into a 365-day calendar with 3 agricultural seasons. Astronomical observations, temple records, and administrative documents show they synchronized rituals, taxes, and planting cycles with celestial timing. Why it matters: your phone's calendar traces one of its ancestors here. This was statecraft and survival wrapped in stargazing. 27. Their year was tidy, except for the pesky extra quarter day they ignored. They settled on 365 days divided into 12 months and 3 seasons, but they didn't add the roughly 6-hour extra that modern leap years fix. That tiny error drifted the calendar slowly out of sync with the Nile and the seasons until later reforms. Evidence: astronomical correlations and priestly complaints in later sources. Why it matters: a calendar mismatch made holidays wander through the seasons over centuries. Tiny math, big cultural consequences. 28. The epigomenal 5 days were sacred and scandalous at once. At the end of the 365-day year, Egyptians tacked on 5 festival days, born of God's days, when the myths said major deities were born. Those days were often exempt from normal labor and full of feasting. Tomb inscriptions and festival lists show these days were culturally charged and politically useful. Rulers associated themselves with divine births. Why it matters: it shows how calendar design reinforced theology and royal legitimacy. 29. Rome fixed the missing quarter day, and that changed a lot. Julius Caesar's reform, advised by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, introduced the leap year to correct the drift the Egyptians' calendar had accumulated. Roman sources and later calendrical histories acknowledge Egyptian astronomical knowledge fed directly into the Julian system. Why it matters: the fix that gave us February 29th owes a clear intellectual debt to Egyptian timekeeping. 30. They engineered water like carpenters shape wood. Egyptians used shadoufs, canals, basin irrigation, and simple weirs to move Nile water into fields. Archaeological remains of canals, rock-cut channels, and irrigation relics show a civilization finely tuned to seasonal flooding. Evidence includes irrigation markings, ancient maps, and textual references in administrative papyri. Why it matters: the food surplus from this waterworks system underwrote cities, armies, and monumental building. Hydraulic engineering was state power. 31. There may once have been a natural river branch that helped builders, now buried. Some archaeologists and satellite surveys point to an ancient Nile branch, sometimes named Arhamat Aramate in fragmentary sources, that could have run closer to pyramid construction sites and eased transport of massive stones. Geophysical prospection and sediment cores suggest differing prehistoric river courses. The buried branch hypothesis remains under investigation. Why it matters: if true, the logistics puzzle of hauling multi-ton blocks gets suddenly less mystical and more ingenious. Indefinido. Verify name or date of Arhamat or Aramate. 32. The Khufu boat proves they weren't joking about shipping great things on the Nile. The intact boat found near Khufu's pyramid, carefully disassembled and buried beside the king, offers a direct look at royal shipbuilding. Pegged planking, sophisticated hull form, and evidence of seafaring knowledge. The reconstruction and experimental archaeology of these boats show they could handle heavy cargo and long river voyages. Why it matters: pyramids weren't built in a vacuum. Boats and barges were the civilization's heavy-lift cranes. 33. Quarrying and stoneworking were brutal, precise crafts. Stoneworkers used copper saws, abrasive sand, wooden wedges, and controlled fire to split hard stone and shape granite and limestone. Quarry inscriptions, tool marks, and experimental replication indicate a mix of brute force and clever technique. Why it matters: what looks monolithic to our eyes is actually the product of repeatable, ingenious methods, not miracles. 34. Moving giant blocks was logistics, not magic, and rivers did most of the heavy lifting. Evidence such as ancient docking sites, seasonal transport records in papyri, and the discovery of ramps and sled grooves suggest the Nile's seasonal rise let builders float heavy blocks close to sites. Workers used sledges lubricated with water to reduce friction. Why it matters: that image of thousands hauling stones uphill is half the myth. Water and planning turned impossibility into coordinated labor. 35. Obelisks didn't stay put. Empire powers literally stole them. Obelisks were ideological trophies. Egyptians carved and erected them. Later rulers carted them off to demonstrate power. Stone inscriptions and later Roman records show dozens were removed to Rome, Paris, London, and New York. Why it matters: modern skylines are dotted with displaced monuments that once proclaimed Egyptian kingship, artifacts as political loot. 36. The Rosetta Stone broke a language barrier and birthed Egyptology, a decree inscribed in 3 scripts, hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek, gave scholars like Champollion the key to decipher hieroglyphs. The discovery transformed our ability to read Egyptian voices from the past. The stone's inscription and the chain of scholarship are well documented. Why it matters: without it, the papyrus world would still be mute. This is the literal Rosetta key to understanding the civilization and its creepy secrets. 37. Fayum portraits turned mummies into eerily lifelike faces. In the Roman period, Egyptians painted realistic panel portraits that were affixed to mummies. These Fayum portraits have uncanny realism, creating a human visage that looks straight at us from millennia ago. Pigment analysis and burial contexts date these to Roman Egypt and show a hybrid Greco-Egyptian funerary aesthetic. Why it matters: these faces collapse time. Looking at them feels intimate and oddly unsettling, because we recognize an individual where we usually see ritual anonymity. 38. Tutankhamun's dagger was made of meteoric iron, ancient star metal. Metallurgical studies of Tutankhamun's iron dagger show high nickel and cobalt consistent with meteoritic iron. Tomb inventories and analytical reports back this up. Ancient smiths prized meteoric iron as celestial material, sometimes treating it as divine. Why it matters. The presence of cosmic metal in a burial blends heaven and earth in a way that's both poetic and eerie. 39. Archaeologists keep finding gilded burials called the man in gold. Reports in recent seasons described a richly gilded burial, nicknamed in the press as a man in gold, with a gold-wrapped face and elaborate funerary kit. Such finds echo older discoveries of lavish, non-royal burials. Grave goods, gilding techniques, and associated inscriptions help situate these burials in the social hierarchy. Why it matters. Opulent burials remind us death was also a theater of wealth and status, and sometimes the treasures keep turning up. Indefinido. Verify press name date of man in gold find. 40. Saqqara keeps giving up surprises, dozens of new tombs and painted coffins. Recent excavations in Saqqara revealed worker cemeteries, elaborately painted coffins, and ritual spaces. Archaeologists are still cataloguing dozens of burials, with unexpected details like colored inscriptions and preserved textiles. Field reports, photographs, and preliminary papers document these finds. Why it matters. Saqqara is a layered archive where everyday Egyptians and elites both left traces, and it keeps expanding our sense of who got buried and why. 41. They bred and mummified young lions, not just cats. Excavations have uncovered mummified lion cubs and remains consistent with captive breeding and ritual use. Animal necropolises contain crocodiles, ibises, and millions of cat mummies. Veterinary analysis and burial inventories show these animals were part of ritual economies and temple offerings. Why it matters. It's eerie to imagine temples running animal husbandry clinics to feed religious markets and to see the scale of devotion made literal in flesh. 42. The lost golden city near Luxor read like a living urban Pompeii. In 2021, archaeologists announced a large, remarkably intact urban settlement, nicknamed the Lost Golden City, with streets, houses, bakeries, and workshops dating to the reign of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. Architectural remains, pottery, and preserved floors gave an unprecedented snapshot of daily life. Why it matters. Cities preserve smell, mess, and routine. Finding an ancient city is like unlocking a day-in-the-life time capsule that's sometimes more telling than palaces and tombs. 43. The labyrinth of Hawara might be part reality, part legend. Classical authors like Herodotus described a labyrinth near Hawara, an extraordinary complex of corridors and chambers connected to the Fayum. Yet archaeological investigations find ruins that may correspond while leaving gaps between report and ruin. Some excavated masonry and subterranean complexes match elements of the story, but the full literary labyrinth remains elusive. Why it matters. It's a reminder that ancient authors shaped legend around real architecture, blurring the line between built space and myth. Indefinido. Classical accounts versus archaeological match. 44. The screaming mummy links forensic science to palace power plays. The grotesque face, sometimes called the screaming mummy, may be linked to the harem conspiracy that targeted Ramses III. CT scans, wound analysis, and papyri describing trials point to violent deaths and political assassination. Forensic work on mummies and the judicial papyri that record the conspiracy connect violent individual fates to court politics. Why it matters. It's a forensic thriller in bone and ink, political murder preserved as a physical artifact. 45. The Treaty of Kadesh is one of the earliest known diplomatic contracts. Ramses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, and later Hattusili III in surviving documents, negotiated a formal agreement after decades of conflict. The bilingual records, treaty stele and diplomatic letters, are material traces of interstate diplomacy. Why it matters. The ancient Near East had formalized peacemaking and legal language centuries before modern international law. Diplomacy is as old and as tactical as war. 46. Rome didn't just borrow Egyptian motifs, it cannibalized monuments. Beyond obelisks, Roman builders stripped temples for blocks, reused columns, and repurposed reliefs. Archaeological stratigraphy and reuse patterns show massive recontextualization of Egyptian stone across the Mediterranean. Why it matters? Much of what we see outside Egypt is a palimpsest of imperial taste and theft. Monuments kept meaning by being moved, but often stripped of original context. 47. Desert glass and meteoritic mysteries left weird souvenirs in the sands. Libyan desert glass and meteorite fragments appear in archaeological contexts across North Africa and Egypt. People collected and sometimes worked these translucent glasses into ornaments or placed them in burials. Geological analysis and find contexts place such materials as exotic valuables. Why it matters? Ancient people gathered cosmic fallout and turned it into ritual items, the cosmos literally embedded in material culture. 48. Oracles and divination mattered, sometimes in military decisions. Oracular centers like the Oracle of Amun guided kings and generals. Consultations could legitimize campaigns or ratify royal claims. We have inscriptions, temple records, and classical reports attesting to oracular consultations, including those tied to Alexander the Great and later Ptolemaic rulers. Why it matters? Even the most pragmatic state machinery paused to ask the gods before big moves. Belief and bureaucracy were entwined. 49. Modern scans reveal hidden voids inside the Great Pyramid, room for imagination. Montomography and non-invasive scanning have detected previously unknown voids and anomalies within Khufu's pyramid. These results, reported by international teams, don't spell out purpose, but they open questions about construction and symbolic design. Why it matters? The Great Pyramid still guards secrets. Concrete new data, not myth, keeps archaeologists awake and public imaginations buzzing. 50. Cleopatra's tomb remains one of archaeology's most seductive, unsolved puzzles. Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony's deaths closed a dramatic chapter, but the location of their tomb, or even whether a richly furnished burial remains undiscovered, still divides scholars. Excavations at Taposiris Magna, underwater surveys around Alexandria, and small finds referenced in classical sources have generated competing hypotheses. None is conclusive. Why it matters? The hunt for Cleopatra's resting place is more than celebrity archaeology. Finding it would reshape narratives about the Hellenistic world's end and how Egyptians and Greeks blended ritual, politics, and identity. Multiple teams keep digging, diving, and scanning, and that unresolved question keeps the past present, urgent, and haunting. Additional, verify claims, and specific excavation statuses. These 50 secrets, social shocks, ritual surprises, medical ingenuity, engineering boldness, and archaeological cliffhangers add up to more than a list of curiosities. They rewire our mental picture of ancient Egypt from a dusty museum backdrop into a messy, brilliant, often unsettling human world. They show people who argued over wages, used cosmetics as medicine, put games in graves, bargained with the dead, cut political rivals out of their memory, and wrapped their kings in meteoric metal. They reveal how modern states borrowed, stole, and reshaped Egyptian monuments, and how new technologies keep reopening old mysteries. If one of these made your jaw drop, tell us which number shocked you the most. Like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend who loves mysteries. There are more ancient surprises waiting in the sand.